I'm actually really excited to finally make it out here to the Kolomoki Mounds because I went to college not too far from here, but I never really did get the opportunity to come down. I made it to the Etowah Indian Mounds, and then I made it to ones further south just today, but I really do think that Kolomoki is probably the most beautiful mound complex in all of the southeast, if not even more beautiful than Cahokia. And it was built again by the Weedon Island and Swift Creek cultures, the Swift Creek being that one culture I talked about a little bit earlier that encompassed all of the Florida Panhandle all the way up the Georgia, South Carolina coasts. But it's absolutely beautiful, and it was made from about 300 to 600 CE, and it would have taken 2 million baskets full of dirt just to make the one behind me, but I believe there are 6 or 7 lying around the site. And it was even more interesting, they built it with alternating layers of red and yellow clay. And again, they had the grave goods made of copper, as well as a few made of iron, which would have been incredibly rare, especially for a Stone Age tribe. And this whole site is absolutely fantastic. It's beautiful. You've got apparently these mounds also line up a lot of times with the solstice and with the equinox. So there's a very complex cosmology here, but again, the culture has died out and we don't know anything about what they truly believed. But it's fascinating just to stand out here and think what it must have been like. Because right now, I'm standing in the ceremonial plaza where you would have watched plays taking place and ceremonies and rituals on top of the temple mound, and looking directly at the burial mound where the faces and the skulls were buried, facing the east towards the rising sun. Whew. So here we are at the top of Mound A. I'm a bit winded and I'm surrounded by a big cloud of gnats, but behind me is Mound D. And if you see, the sun is just a little bit above me. It's probably causing quite a bit of lens flare right now, but I'll give you a better shot of Mound D in a minute. Now Mound D, as well as the positioning of D to A, is immensely important because of the probable cosmology that these people had here at the mound builder culture, or the Mississippian period, because the Weedon Island and the Swift Creek culture were just as a little expression of that, even though it was in the deep south and far removed from the main sort of hub areas of the mound builders. But Mound D, inside of that mound were found 77 people, and a lot of them were dressed as warriors or high members of society and would have been very esteemed. But all of their faces were pointing towards the east and towards the rising sun. So right now, they would be facing the camera. They are facing towards this direction, and now the sun is setting, and they're setting behind the bodies. So this mound as well, the one that we're standing on right now, it is Mound A, and I should have specified it was layered with yellow clay and capped with red clay. So the red clay must have been the final capstone to a ceremonial mound. And as far as I know, and as far as the archaeologists say, no actual structures were found on top of this mound, which differentiates it from several other mounds, especially in the main mound builder periods. But if we take a look around the site, one of the places that I noticed that was interesting was very similar to sites that I saw in the UK. They still hold spiritual significance for the people here, even into modern day. And a lot of families would actually put their cemeteries on top of the Indian mounds. And you see that as you drive into the park looking to your right. There's a very small mound, but you can see modern day gravestones on it. And I think that's a very fascinating connection between modern day and ancient past. It's people wanting to live ancient history or be a part of that history. And I can totally understand that, although I don't think I'd want to be buried inside of a sacred mound. And I just wanted to say that the road I'm standing on right now, forms a fascinating alignment between Mound A and the burial mound, where the equinox would set right over these two mounds, right down the central axis. The first thing that you'll see after leaving the visitor center and walking straight down is the beautiful Earth Lodge, which was finally unearthed and excavated in 1938. Now, the Earth Lodge, I always like to compare these lodges, and the one behind me is very unique, but I like to compare them to ones that I saw in Europe. This one I'll compare to the Hill of Terra. Now, during the equinox, or the solstice, I forget which, the Hill of Terra has an opening which is kind of curved on the inside with a low roof, so you would have to crawl to get inside of it. On top of that, the sun during the equinox is the only time of year, but it comes right through the center, and the sun right now is right up over this direction, and the opening is right here, so it has a perfect view to the sunrise on the east. It would come through the center and light up an altar. And this is sort of a lighting up of a spiritual place that only happens once a year. It would have taken immense spiritual significance. At the same time, this Earth Lodge does seem to be some sort of a feminine fertility symbol mixed with masculine. So I judge this by the fact that the lodge itself looks like a womb. It's a large, almost round type structure. It's circular as compared to the square mounds that are near it, and it's also located right next to a river, running water, a very feminine symbol. And then you have within different areas, you do have more masculine symbols. The idea of light penetrating down the hallway and striking an altar is a more masculine thing, because traditionally, you know, round shapes, the moon, running water, that's more feminine. The sun and trees and, you know, hardness, that's for men. And so the mound behind me has a more interesting interior, but we can't get inside of it. And I do believe a lot of it is more reconstructed. They layered over it so it wouldn't degrade with time. But there's a beautiful eagle, and this eagle forms near the entrance. There's 3 seats on the eagle which are elevated. These would have been for the most important members of society here. And around, in a circular pattern, are 47 seats, bringing it to a total of 50. Now, the 3 seats on the eagle has a forked eye symbol, which is an incredibly, again, sacred to the people who built this. And on top of that, the Creek were the people who kind of claimed descendant from this. They are called the Okmulgee, although they kind of claim this as their ancestral homeland, which it was. They are descendants, and it was a 17,000 year lineage, ending most recently with the Creek, or with the Okmulgee. And they claim that they came from the west, you know, from far to the west, and that they sat down here. And there is precedence for this, because the Pawnee tribe made very similar earthen lodges. Now, if you walk around the southern ceremonial complex, if you walk around the woodland area down here, and you see the southern Mississippian culture, especially towards the bottom of the valley, because they would follow the rivers from the Appalachia area. I mean, we also saw the other mounds up more towards Helen, Georgia. But as you come down here, the culture gradually changed. And it wasn't a united culture, as some people like to portray it, but it was sort of a group of chiefdoms, and the one here at Okmulgee was entirely different. It had different cultures, but a lot of the religious aspects of it were the same. The use of the eagle, the use of the mound, the use of the sort of chiefdom structure. Here we have evidence at the seating, which was permanent, of sort of a most likely traditional clan type structure whereby 47 people would be sitting around 3 main guys. And in the center of it we have burnt charcoal, which dates from 1015. So we know that this was several hundred years, 500 years before Columbus came, and we also know that it was an incredibly important part of this ceremonial complex, which I'll explore now. Now I'm looking directly ahead of me behind the camera at the earthen mounds, and I did want to say it's kind of interesting for me to think of the earthen mound as a possible extension of rock eagle, because the rock eagle was a very important part of the southern ceremonial complex, and nobody really knows who built the rock eagle. To the left is the Cornfield Mound, which isn't very impressive in terms of size, but it's right next to probably the most important ceremonial complex. I can envision people walking out of the ceremonial complex and then going to do something on top of the Cornfield Mound, although this is either tribal knowledge or something that we don't know. And I do want to mention, and get up on my high horse for a second, that from the 18th century onwards into present day, this was viewed as sort of an awe-inspiring ancient monument. And you have quotes from explorers saying it demonstrates the ancient lost wisdom of these people. Well, this was only a couple centuries before Columbus came in, and these people are still around. This isn't like the ancient Egyptians, even though the ancient Egyptians, their modern descendants are still there. This is the Creek people built this in relatively recent times and were forced out. And now they still come back here every now and then to do pilgrimage. But this isn't something to be viewed as ancient history. This is still a sacred space for the Creek people. And if you take a look now, I'm going to be showing kind of like zoomed in videos of this, but a railroad has been built directly through here, probably destroying a huge number of sacred ceremonial sites. But this was only, I believe, in the 1930s or 40s that this railroad was built through here. But the National Park Service has now since officially apologized for this and has a lot of displays kind of explaining where they went wrong in that aspect. Behind me now is the so-called Funeral Mound. And the Funeral Mound, I thought I was actually heading in the direction of the McDougal Mound, but the Funeral Mound was very sadly damaged during the construction of that railroad. However, when archaeologists went in to go take a look and see what was buried there, they found the remains of over 100 people. And this demonstrated a very advanced culture because the people who were buried here, many of them had copper ornaments, shell ornaments, and the copper ornaments would have come down most likely from the Lake Michigan or the Great Lakes area and migrated down the river. So there was evidence of a very advanced trade structure. Now this place is still sacred to the Creek and the Muskogee, but it should be remembered that the idea of tribes were not the sort of idea of European states and borders that we have in our minds today as Westerners. These tribes, the Creek and the Muskogee, were themselves descended from the woodland culture and from the mound builders, although this was not at all a united tribe. These 100 people behind me were part of the Southern Ceremonial Complex, but they most likely would have considered themselves different or unique from all of the other areas in this ceremonial complex. And as such, these 100 plus people would have been very influential figures from this village and possibly even from abroad, judging by the implements that were found on their bodies. And it's so unfortunate to think of all of the bodies that were disturbed during the building of this railroad. And this is, again, a very sacred spot because there are people alive today that are descended, presumably from the people buried behind me. Behind me now you'll see the Great Temple Mound and the Lesser Temple Mound. The one that is nearest to the camera, the Lesser Temple Mound, you can see the road cuts right through it, and it was very horribly damaged, and so it's impossible to tell really what is happening inside of the mound. I mean, archaeologists have taken looks at it, but now it's just really destroyed by the building of the roads and the railroad tracks. However, the Great Temple Mound has evidence of there being some sort of a dirt ramp that would have led up to the top where there would have been a large ceremonial structure. It's very possible that they would have held an eternal flame here, similar to the Cherokee, that they would have had ceremonies here, or that it could have held a townhouse where community meetings were held. It's fascinating to think of the meetings held here, and it's also possible or more likely that this place was built between the years 900 and 1100 AD. Behind me now is an absolutely beautiful Native American burial mound, and it tells the story of a tribe that is more or less overlooked. And the mound itself, being so close to a road, is also itself quite overlooked. The history you should know is that it was built by something called the St. John's culture. Now, we don't know much about the St. John's culture. We don't know their chiefdoms. We don't know much about their history. All we know was that they had very similar burial practices, similar customs, and lived in the area stretching from around South Georgia and Altamaha down to the Gulf and along the coast of eastern Florida around the St. Augustine area. And this group later merged into a group called the Timucua Native Americans. And the Timucua were a very sizable population. Around the 1500s, when the Spaniards arrived, they had 35 chiefdoms and thousands of members, but by the time they left in the late 1700s for Cuba on a boat as refugees, there were fewer than 100 people left. And there is some thought that the Timucua may have survived in Cuba, but it's unconfirmed. And it might also be that some of them survived here in Florida and Georgia and sort of joined with the Seminoles and assimilated into their tribe. But what is so fascinating about the mound behind me is that rather than being built out of shells and rather than being a shell midden, as was common in the area around here, the St. John's culture built out of sand. And what happened was when you died in the tribe, especially if you were an important member of their society, there would be a charnel house built on the outskirts of the village. This would be a wooden platform, oftentimes over water, because it appears to be an ancient, going back tens of thousands of years, which is incredibly ancient, belief that the spirit could not sort of escape the body and go somewhere else, or that if the body was either in a mound or above water, the spirit couldn't run off and get lost. And this is at least the belief that has been gathered from their burial practices. So at these charnel houses, you would have a sort of temple going out into a pond or a lake on the outskirts of the village, and it was an incredibly respected job to be the bone picker. And these bodies would dissolve, decay over time, and the bone pickers would remove the flesh, let the elements do what they did, clean the bones, and then inter them in mounds like the one behind me. And it's said that when they did really emergency restoration work on this mound in 1982 for the construction of some of these roads, they found over 124 Native American people buried here. And supposedly, these people still are buried here. But I think that it could be a better place for this mound because there's so much noise here and it's a public park and it's not quite well known of a spot as places like Etowah, although it is still just as fascinating. Behind me at this unassuming hill just north of Tampa, Florida, is the original Pocahontas story. It's called the Princess Hirahigua story, and they belong to a tribe called the Timucua Indians. Now, the original story begins in 1526. That's when a man named Juan Ortiz and a small party of people was sent up from Spanish Cuba to find a lost member of an expedition that had been sent a couple years prior. This expedition was led by a man named Navarro, and Navarro had caused a lot of real problems to the local Indians, as you do, especially if you're a conquistador. You go in, you kill a lot of people, and you convert to Christianity. So there were a lot of ill feelings. So Juan Ortiz was captured by King Hirahigua, or Prince Hirahigua, and sentenced to be brought up to the mound behind me, either to be clubbed to death or burnt. Now, his daughter, his eldest daughter, Princess Hirahigua, came forward and said, "I'm in love with him, don't kill him." Or at least she pleaded with him, saying, "He's just an innocent man, let him go." Now, eventually, Prince Hirahigua heard her out, calmer voices prevailed, but then he got mad again and again and again because years were passing and nobody was coming for Juan Ortiz. And these feelings of cultural hatred came up because the Spanish always killed. There was just so much bloodshed going on, and Juan Ortiz was often blamed for it. But Princess Hirahigua was helping to calm that, but eventually she helped Juan Ortiz escape to a sub-Timucan chiefdom led by another chief which she desired to marry. And she ran off with Juan Ortiz, who lived with her while she married this sub-Timucan chiefdom, and combined their tribe or coalesced into a new chiefdom, while Juan Ortiz waited until 1539, over a decade, for Hernando de Soto to come and rescue him and bring him back to Cuba. But this story was later retold in the Pocahontas story, which may or may not have happened in the way that it was told. Clearly, it didn't happen the way that Disney showed it, because she was something like 12 or 13 at the time. But this is a very Americanized telling of the Hirahigua story, and I think it's a very interesting place behind me. Behind me again is the Hirahigua Mound, and I should probably specify a little bit more about the actual history of this. Now, Hirahigua was a real person as far as we can tell. Certainly Juan Ortiz was a real person who was rescued by Hernando de Soto, but the tribe here began forming around the year 1000, and this is very common to other Native American tribes. They would kind of form as a large group of confederated chiefdoms and then switch into something else at a different time. But the actual name of the tribe here was called the Tocobaga. But eventually, like the St. John's culture and like the Timucua Indians, they, by the 1700s, had almost become nothing. Now, it's understood that their language was very similar to Creek or Seminole, so a large number of them went to the Appalachia region or coalesced into the Seminole tribe, but as a people, by the 1700s, they had almost entirely been wiped off the map because of the Spanish, because of the incoming English settlers, and because of the Indian wars with the Americans. So you can understand why King Hirahigua was quite mad at Juan Ortiz. But I mean, these feelings were boiling up amongst the tribes here in Florida in the southeast for a long period of time. So you can see the kind of conflict that led to it. But the mound behind me dates back to probably half a millennia before Hirahigua saved Juan Ortiz, and it was a religious and ceremonial center for the Tocoba tribe. But a fascinating and lost religion, although you can still consider it a sacred place for the Seminole people if you would consider the Tocoba a part of the Seminole. Behind me, you might easily overlook it, but I think it is one of the most fascinating parts of the Crystal River site, because most of the mound builders never built in stone. This is an entirely unique feature to Crystal River, and it is a stele, or a limestone chunk or carving, which has been brought here from somewhere else. Now, there's no carvings in this one, but there's a number of these still lying around, and we know that they aren't just boulders because they form some sort of ceremonial positioning. Directly in front of me right now is the burial mound C, surrounded by, or really capped by, burial mound F, because C surrounds burial mound F. And then directly over in this direction is the second temple mound. And the second temple mound had a ramp which led directly to this stone. Now, this stone isn't carved, but there is another one on the site which is carved, which has a very fascinating story and possible ties to the Mayans, although I think it's too soon to make the connection to the Mayans. I'll give some of the information that I've heard about that, which I think is very interesting, but there is inherently a little bit of a danger when you attribute things just to the Mayans. It's the same as the Montezuma mythology that I explored in the Southwest, but I'll explain that in a little more detail at the Stele 1. Now, I'm standing here in front of Stele 1 on the opposite side of burial mound C, and I wanted to tell the story of the possible Mayan connection with this site. But I wanted to start by saying that it is very dangerous to immediately postulate a Mayan connection. A lot of people, particularly new History Channel shows like this America Unearthed, they like to postulate this Mayan connection because it's almost a semi-racist attitude. It's this idea that, oh, the woodland people could not have built this, it must have been the Mayans. Now, this is usually applied towards a lot of petroglyphs, a lot of faces, particularly things from the Southeast ceremonial complex, because they look very similar to Mayan. However, there is a small correlation with the language. Some words that were used by the cultures in this part of Florida, in the Panhandle, or near central, western Florida, correlate or sound similar to Mayan words. And a lot of the objects found here and the pottery had patterns on it that correlated with Mayan. Now, this isn't to suggest that a large contingent of Mayans came over to Florida, but it was possibly a small number of people on boats who came over in the distant past and carved the stone behind me. Now, over the years, the weather has really destroyed the face of the stone and taken out a lot of the real important features, but what you would see is a fascinating face, almost that looks like the Scream, the famous painting, with, a hair coming down from the back, bald head, but a ponytail, or, just a long length of hair. And it's a fascinating portrait of what people think they may have looked like back at this period of time. And again, they postulate a Mayan connection because, one, they can't explain why this site, out of all of the other mound sites, has stele, and two, because some of the words are similar. Now, there's no real genetic evidence, but I think it's a fascinating thought just to think about. I'm really braving a lot of mosquitoes to come out here and show this, but I think that the mound behind me, even though it isn't the most visually impressive at the Crystal River site, I think is one of the most spiritually significant. It's burial mound F, which is the large conical mound on top, surrounded by a much lower burial mound C. And compared to other mounds like Cahokia or Etowah, this is a conical mound, and it was used specifically for burial. And they believe that the burials here started around 250, 260 BC, and they believe that there's about 1,200 to 1,500 people buried here. And they range a good deal of time. The burials continued even though certain cultures collapsed and came up. And this is most evidenced by the fact that a lot of them were found with very beautiful copper plates and copper war materials. And when you consider the fact that these were Stone Age people, this copper must have come from the Ohio River and from the Great Lakes area. And it would make it down because you had a mound building culture that was split into many different segments. You can't consider it one united culture, but this was the southernmost expression of that culture. It was called the Mississippian culture. Now, it is so unique to have the Mississippian culture down here this far south into Florida. And this copper must have come from such a very far away, but eventually their society collapsed and they no longer had copper, but they still had shark teeth necklaces, pearls, and things that made them look like very rich people, noble members of society, village elders, warriors, things like this. So you can imagine this is 12 to 1,500 of the most influential members of their society, and nowadays we have no idea who they were, but it's almost inspiring to think about who is buried behind me. So many hundreds of people. What must their stories be like? Behind me now is a ramp going to what archaeologists call Temple Mound H, and there's a lot of debate over what happened at this mound. I believe there were no bodies actually found buried in it, so this would have been most likely a sort of religious site or even a speaking mound. They say that it could have been used for speeches, could have been used to rally the troops to war or call for peace, or even to do plays or sort of sports on top of it. These cultures were known to develop ball games and sort of different competitive things, and it would have been a fascinating place to visit, but it is also a fascinating place to see nowadays, although my camera only does it so much justice. The sort of elevated thing you see right here is a ramp, and it goes up to about a dozen feet off the flat ground. And that's another important thing to remember, because I see the boats right ahead of me. The Crystal River goes right past this site, just like rivers go past most mounds. You know, the Etowah Mounds is the most visible, but you always have rivers near these mounds. Even in Europe, you have rivers near places like the Hill of Tara. It's a very religious type symbolism, and I believe it represents feminine sort of fertility symbols to have a mound with people in it, almost like a womb near running water. But this mound is such a fascinating place, especially because, again, it's less visually impressive than the main temple mound on the site, which is directly across here through the burial mound, through Mound F and C. Behind me now is another fascinating mystery of the Crystal River site. Now this is a sand burial mound that's actually found just next to the parking lot to the left as you walk in right from the museum. And they found that this was a burial mound as well, but they used sand. And the mound, obviously, it's a lot less visually impressive than the original burial mound and the temple mounds. But they found that they had no copper. They had no copper grave goods. They had no lavish ornamentation, but using radiocarbon dating, they also found that these burials must have happened at the same time. So you have here represented either two separate cultures or clear evidence that there was a strict class division within the society of the people who lived at this site. Now, directly to my left as I face it, and behind me and to the right, are two what are called shell midden mounds. And these predate a lot of the structures on the site and are certainly even more impressive than the sand burial pit, which would have probably been used for regular members of society and not the noble class. But this shows, it's older than 1,000 years, and it shows that there was a thriving village built right along the banks of the river. And over the centuries, they would throw their used shells, their old pottery, their broken arrowheads, they would throw them into these piles, and it gradually made basically what was for them a garbage dump. And they basically lived between or around these mounds, and these would have been some of the first solid structures on the site. And especially in the southeast, near Florida, near the Georgia coast, and near the rivers, this is how archaeologists are easily able to identify the sites of ancient villages. Most of them didn't have any mounds in them. Behind me now is the main temple mound at Crystal Creek. Behind me now is the main temple mound at the Crystal River site, and sort of the crowning jewel of the whole place. It's the main temple mound located directly along the river, which I hope you can see, but I'll give you a clear glimpse of a little bit later in the videos. And it was created, or this site was first occupied, around 1,600 years ago by a culture known as the Deptford culture. And rather than the Mississippian culture, this Deptford culture would have spanned all the way from the Florida Panhandle down south to probably around Sarasota or Venice area, all the way through the Georgia-Florida border and up right into South Carolina. It was a pretty expansive culture that was centered more around the bayous, the swamps, and the coasts. However, around 200 AD, this culture split into two, one emerging as a culture more towards the center and eastern part of Florida, and the Panhandle, which was called the Swift Creek culture, which adapted many of the customs from the Mississippian culture, and that's where they got all their copper from. And that's also perhaps where they gained their mound building skills from, although a lot of cultures in Florida at the same time also built mounds because the material here was easier to build with. You always had a plentiful supply of shells and sand. But this mound, about half of it is gone now, but from it you can gain a clear view of the site, and it's also probably the most important mound because it is located directly on the river, which is just a beautiful thing to see. And originally there would not have been any trees here, but nowadays they keep the trees here presumably to hold all the soil together, the same way that they usually plant those reeds on the beaches so the beach doesn't wash out. The erosion at these sites is actually a very serious issue, as we'll see a little bit later with the petroglyphs on the stele directly over to my right. Now try to imagine this site as it would have been back when it was occupied by these ancient mound builders. You would have had canoes in the water, and if you looked over in this direction, there would probably be no trees. But directly ahead now, you would have seen the two shell middens and the sort of village used by the underclass members of society. Directly through these trees, which definitely would not have been on the mound back in the day, you would have seen the burial mounds, the main burial mounds for the noble members of society. And over here, you would have seen the stele with the supposedly Mayan glyphs on it.